I'm Alex, and this is episode 2 of the Astrological Chronicle. Today I'll focus just on the Saturn-Uranus square, since our experience is largely defined through this complex. Let's take a look again at the current world transits to visualize where these planets are. In Aquarius, at 22 degrees, is Saturn. In 18 degrees, Taurus, 87 degrees away, 90 degrees being a perfect square, but 3 degrees is well within orb, is Uranus. Last week I mentioned the January 6th insurrection as an example of the Saturn-Uranus square. InfoWars commentator Alex Jones has been in the news a lot this week, and his misinformation played a role in January 6th. Both are good examples of the Saturn-Uranus complex. Richard Tarnas, a historian and an astrologer, has noted that Saturn-Uranus alignments correspond with, quote, conservative, reactionary, or right-wing parties or leaders defining themselves as the force of freedom and rebellion, end quote. During Alex Jones's sentencing this past week, he attempted to make the point that what he was doing was free speech. Of course, failing to note that defamation, of which he's been convicted, is not protected free speech. But there we have the Uranian quality, free speech. And Jones himself is very conservative. Jones's behavior in the courtroom more generally has been rebellious and defiant, Uranus, toward the judge, Saturn. And his consistent lying when he was supposed to be telling the truth is an example of his rigid, Saturnian nonconformity, Uranus. Alex Jones rose to power and fame on the premise that he was revealing truths kept secret by those in power. A reactionary and conservative, Saturn, painting himself as a revolutionary, Uranus. And now, the Saturnian archetype has caught up with him, and he is paying, literally, for his lies. This is an example of the circular, interpenetrating nature of the Saturn-Uranus complex. Reaction, rebellion, repeat. Or rebellion, reaction, repeat. The self-proclaimed patriots of the January 6th insurrection saw themselves as connected to that same impulse that founded our nation, rebelling against an imagined tyranny and thus linking themselves to that revolutionary spirit. Now, a year and a half later, the January 6th committee is illustrating in clear, factual detail, which is a Saturnian characteristic, the events of the insurrection and what led up to them. So again, we see the recursive nature of the Saturn-Uranus complex. Perpetrators of a rebellious, conservative movement being brought to justice. As an example of the sort of technological breakdown that is a feature of the Saturn-Uranus complex, Uranus having to do with technology and Saturn causing the breakdown, we saw the accidental transmission of all of the contents of Alex Jones' cell phone to the prosecutors in his case by his own attorneys, the contents of which altered the direction of the trial. And now the January 6th committee is very interested in those documents. Another way we might recognize the Saturn-Uranus complex is in another event I mentioned last week, the Dobbs decision. Richard Tarnas also points out that Uranus always brings out elements of freedom and choice, and Saturn emphasizes constraint and limit. In one way, this can be burdened by too much choice, but it can also be a forced freedom. In the case of Dobbs, where states are now making abortion illegal, the pro-life movement prioritizes the freedom of the unborn fetus or child while restricting the rights of the pregnant person. A positive example of Saturn-Uranus is the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's a very limited package and may not change inflation much, but it does close some corporate loopholes, extend clean energy credits, and allows Medicare to negotiate drug prices. And there we see the emphasis of choice and freedom as it's associated with Uranus. And another example of the Saturn-Uranus breakdown in technology, there was news last week that TikTok rival Triller has been accused on several occasions of not fulfilling its contractual duties to content creators, particularly Black creators. Uranus is present both in the technology company's claim that it creates financial freedom to underrepresented creators, but it also is the disruption, the breaking down of a contractual agreement, the erratic and non-existent payments. This contractual breach has caused real hardship for those creators and driven some into deep debt. Both the contract and the hardship are related to Saturn. Additionally, the Saturn-Uranus complex is present in the unexpected or sudden shifts as it relates to justice. 4 officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor face new federal charges by the Justice Department. Saturn is present in the status quo that allowed these officers to escape accountability in the first place. It is the Uranian work of the activists and the protests that were a driving force in bringing about these new charges. Also, after years of public protests and outcry, those who murdered Ahmaud Arbery are finally facing justice. That's it for this video. In the next one, I'll take a look at the Mars-Uranus conjunction as it relates to Saturn and the Mercury-Saturn opposition as it relates to that Saturn-Uranus complex.